So our speaker this morning is Marta McDowell from New Jersey, where she's a member of the Untitled Chapter of Yards. She also teaches landscape history and horticulture at the New York Botanical Garden, and she's also a garden consultant. She's the author of 4 books. The first one's called Beatrix Potter's Gardening Life, which won a gold award from the Garden Writers Association. She wrote a book on the gardens of poet Emily Dickinson. She also wrote a book on Laura Ingalls Wilder. And she was the author who wrote the book Little House on the Prairies in the 1930s and 40s, which became the TV series, as some of you know. She's here today to talk about her 4th book, All of the President's Gardens, which was on the New York Times bestseller list, and also won a book award from the American Horticultural Society. She also writes for various publications, including New York Times, Fine Gardening, and Hortus magazine. So please welcome Marta McDowell.
Can you all hear me through this microphone? Yes, okay. I usually don't have a problem being heard. I think it's because I was the 4th child, and so if you wanted to be heard, you had to speak up. So I would also like to thank you for inviting me down to spring, because in New Jersey, the trees aren't leafed out yet. My Narcissus February Gold bloomed in April, so that will give you an idea of the kind of spring. We're very behind season this year. However, I'm in big trouble with my chapter of the North American Rock Garden Society. As Bobby said, I'm a member of the Watnong chapter. And what does the Watnong chapter have this weekend? Its annual plant sale. So guess who's not there hawking plants? But, oh well, they'll get along without me.
Ready?
Ready. So, what I'd like to do this morning is tell you a little bit about how I came to write this particular book and give you some of my favorite stories, because isn't that really the best part? I like to connect sort of plants with other parts of our culture, and normally I write about authors who garden, right? Emily Dickinson, Beatrix Potter, etc. And so one day I called my publisher. His name is Tom Fisher, and he's out in Portland, Oregon, Timber Press. And I said, Tom, you know, I would like to write a book about that Concord, Massachusetts crowd. You know, people like Emerson and Hawthorne and Louisa May Alcott and Thoreau. They all gardened together in addition to writing together. This is actually true. There was a period when Thoreau was the Emerson's gardener. He dug beds for them, he grafted apple trees, he planted roses, he planted a lot of buckwheat. Anyway, that's another story. Tom, my editor, said, wow, that sounds really interesting. I'd buy it, but I don't think anyone else would. So much for that. He said, you know, we haven't done a history of American horticulture in a while. Would you be interested in doing that? Now, you know, I'm sitting at my desk in Chatham, New Jersey. He's in Portland, Oregon. I am sure that Tom thought that I was sitting there cheering like this guy and sort of waving the flag, going, oh! Instead, I had this feeling, you know, it's like my heart sank. And I thought, this will take me the rest of my life. And into my head popped this image of another character from American literature, a famous character. See if you recognize him as depicted by Gregory Peck. Who is that? Anyone know? Ahab. That's Captain Ahab. Long quest, you know, it doesn't end too well for Ahab. I thought that is what writing a history of American gardening will be like, because, right, we're a big place, right? So what my friend Sandra, who I'm staying with in Chakawinity, can grow is different from what I can grow in Chatham, New Jersey. It's certainly different from what my brother-in-law grows in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and this map doesn't even have Alaska and Hawaii on it, right? And depending on how you count, it's been a long history. So what to do? You hate to say no, right, if somebody wants to publish a book. So I mulled it over, and as Bobby said, I teach. Now, any of you who have ever taught know that it really is true that you learn from your students. And I teach adults. I teach an 8-week landscape history class, you know, the worldwide history of gardening. So, you know, it's a very thin level, but we cover a lot. And at the end of the class, the students do a really short research project, a 2-page paper and a 10-minute presentation. And one of them had done the White House grounds. And it was absolutely fascinating. And I thought, wait a minute, that could be a way I talk about the whole history, but limit the scope. And so I was very excited and ran downstairs to tell my husband, who said, oh, you're going to steal from a student. No, I did not steal from this student. I asked Seamus, he's acknowledged in the book, and he was very kindly said, yes, go ahead. Now, the other thing that I do like to have is some little personal hook. Now, trust me, none of my family has been near the White House in any way, but I did come across this image. So this is the White House. It's the south side, and it's around 1910, I think. And okay, so plant ID. What's the plant in the lower left-hand corner? Hydrangea. Hydrangea, yeah, probably Hydrangea Paniculata. Really nice plant. In my family photos, I had this image. It's probably not the same species if you're a stickler, but it is a hydrangea, even in the same position. The woman in the sunbonnet is my great-grandmother, Catherine Nealon Ryan, born in County Clare, crosses the Atlantic when she was a teenager, makes her way out to the middle of Illinois. I wish I could ask her why she did, because it's nothing like County Clare, but that's where she stayed, and the little girl is my mother. Anyway, so it was a little reminder to say plants and garden styles move around, right? They move around from kind of a hub, and the White House is one of those style hubs where things show up, if not first, at least early, and they move around the country, plants and design styles. So, where to begin? So I started in 1608 with the first encounter, at least of English explorers in the area that's now Washington, D.C. So Captain John Smith is at Jamestown, right, with the colony, and he gets in a boat with 14 other men, big boat, and they start to row up the Potomac. It was already called that. They were, of course, I think, looking for gold, right? They were disappointed in that, or maybe some passage, right, to the Pacific, didn't find that. They did find agriculture, organized agriculture, so, you know, America's first gardeners, if you will. And what were they growing? Well, they were growing the things they teach the kids about now, right? The three sisters, corn, beans, squash. Even my 4th grade niece comes home talking about the three sisters. What else were they growing? Tobacco. You're in the front row. Tobacco becomes very important to colonial history and to the history of our country. And they were growing something that I weed out of my garden. I wonder if you get it around here. It's a little gray-leafed plant. It has a sort of scallopy leaf. If you let it go to seed, which I don't recommend, it has these kind of drooping seed pods. They were cultivating it as a grain. The genus is Chenopodium, a mouthful. And they found this in the archaeological record. You know, they know this was grown. And I learned through the research of this that it's related to quinoa. Quinoa, or quinoa, which is the way I always thought it was said before someone said it to me. So anyway, already organized agriculture. So then the question is, all right, how did our nation's capital, right, end up there, as opposed to the other candidates, places like, you know, New York City, Philadelphia? Maybe some of you know, right? Alexander Hamilton got his central bank, and the Southern founders got the location of the new federal city. And so that's how it all happened. And if I had known that Alexander Hamilton was going to be so popular, I would have put more about him in the book. So, a little presidential trivia. Did George Washington ever live at the president's house? No, right? He never lives there. I think of him like Moses, right? He sees the promised land. He has a hand in designing it, that never lives there. He actually had a strong hand in designing the new federal city. By 1797, he was retired from being president, and he had help from a Frenchman named Pierre-Charles L'Enfant. L'Enfant had grown up in the village of Versailles. He had trained in Paris. So, of course, when he lays out this brand new city, He lays out a French city. So it has these long diagonal avenues. It's very formal, very geometric. And if he had had his way, the president's house would have been right on one of those straight lines, right on the axis. But George Washington had a whole shelf of English design manuals in his library at Mount Vernon. And one of them said, situate your house up on a hill, up on a rise of land, where the air will be good and people will be able to see your home. And so he asks L'Enfant by letter, that's how we know, to move the president's house up that little rise of land. It's not a big hill, but that's where they put it. So the next time you're in Washington, if you walk from, say, the National Archives to the White House, down Pennsylvania Avenue, you'll notice it takes a big zag. And that is the whole reason why. All right, so we start out with French. And who is the first president who lives in the president's house? Anybody know? This is tough. John Adams. John Adams moves in 1800. It is the end, towards the end of his first term. His wife Abigail joins him about 2 weeks later. And Abigail immediately sits down and writes a letter back to her daughter in Massachusetts. And she talks about the landscaping at the president's house. She says, we have not the least fence, yard, or other convenience. Right? Not so great. The same letter says, you know, I hung out my wet laundry to dry in the unfinished receiving rooms. Because it really wasn't quite done. She even mentions the ride in. She says, woods are all you can see on the way from Baltimore until you reach the city. And she underlines that, which is so only in name. Because remember, this was built on farmland, swamp. I mean, there were a few little villages, but it was basically built from scratch. Now, John and Abigail did not have to suffer these circumstances for long because he lost the election, and in 1801 they pack up. They do not even stay for the inauguration of the next president, Thomas Jefferson. Right, Jefferson, we all know, he was a lifelong gardener. So I thought, ooh, I'm going to find out all of the stuff that he planted at the president's house while he was president. Well, it turns out he was really much busier getting the construction projects finished. He did some street tree planting. Jefferson loved that skinny-leafed oak, willow-leafed oak, Quercus fellows, I think it is. Unfortunately, they ran out of money, so he planted Lombardy poplars instead. So none of those remain. But in addition to planting along the streets and avenues in the new federal city, Jefferson did some indoor gardening. And according to his friend Margaret Bayard Smith, in Jefferson's cabinet, which is what he called his office, in the south-facing windows, he had potted geraniums. They would have been like this one. Now I know you're saying geraniums, they're a dime a dozen. But then it was a very unusual plant. It was a South African import, and it was really considered an exotic. Now, with the geraniums, on plant stands, there were evidently some sort of container-grown roses. Don't know what kind, but she mentions them. And then with the plants, there was a bird cage for his pet mockingbird. Pet mockingbird. I have a caged cockatiel, so I was very interested that Jefferson had a caged mockingbird, because of course I just think of them as wild birds. But at the time it wasn't unusual, and you saw wild mockingbirds being sold as pets right up into the very early 20th century. Jefferson loved mockingbirds, and we even know the name of this particular pet mockingbird. His name was Dick. Right? When I read that, I thought, oh, I can't make this stuff up. It's too good. So you can imagine Jefferson's indoor garden. Now, Jefferson was a two-term president, so he had 8 years, and by the end of his second term, he does start planning for the grounds. And so he and architect Benjamin Latrobe, they draw up a plan, and they basically set the front and the back of the landscape. The front, so the one with that triangular pediment that you see on the news all the time, that was the formal carriage entrance. So it's very French in design, very geometric. The back, which has that rounded portico, was intended as the kind of pedestrian entrance and much more of a park. And in design, much more romantic, like English in style. And Jefferson writes right on the plan in his handwriting words like groves and shrubberies. Again, it sounds like capability brown. So the balance of design is changing at that time. But Jefferson didn't have time to do the planting. He did the planning, and it was the next president who starts to plant, James Madison. So I was very excited because during the Madison administration, I started to see plant orders going out from the president's house to get plants to nurseries. There were already local nurseries. He was ordering trees, lots of trees. He was ordering shrubs, things like lilacs and roses and rose of Sharon, so things that you still might plant, and lots of vegetables. So he was ordering seeds from Philadelphia, and he was also ordering seeds from the Shakers. And I did not think of the Shakers in terms of seeds, but they were known for the quality of their seeds. They grew them in their communities. They collected the seeds and packaged them, much like our seed exchange. And they came up with this idea of we'll have standardized, pre-printed paper packets. And so they would pack them, and then they'd put them in these lovely shaker boxes, and the brothers would take them out and sell them. So you can think of the Shakers when you get your seeds this spring. Didn't last long. All that planting, what happens? Goes up in smoke, right? 1814, the British march into the federal city. It's part of the War of 1812, and they burn the federal buildings. They burn the Capitol, they burn the Library of Congress, they burn the president's house. So James Monroe, the next president, rebuilds. The grounds were ruined. They did keep the shell of the house, the stone shell, so all the stonework was retained. And it's at that point when they gave the house a very bright white coat of paint. And it started to be called informally that White House. And that's where the name comes from. And so later on, they make it the official name. So from now on, we'll call it the White House. So Madison has gardeners replant. He had some help, Monroe does. James Madison sends James Monroe his personal gardener named Charles Bizet, a Frenchman, from his own home in Montpelier, and he sends them up to Washington to help with the replanting. So this was the first gardener's bill I could find, and since I do in part pull weeds for a living, I was very interested in what he had been charging for. So this is basically April 1st to July 1st, so good long period of time. He's spreading a lot of fertilizer, doing some repairs, and hand mowing at $1 a day. I don't know if you've ever mowed something with a sickle or a scythe, but that is not much money. It's also around this time, so now we're moving up into the 1820s, that you start to see images of the White House with ornamental grounds. So you can see by this time, again, this is the back, you see flower beds and paths. And you see another way that they sometimes would keep the grass short. They'd get a neighbor to bring in their flock of sheep. And you see people just strolling around. Again, think public park. I loved this picture because it was the first image I found of a gardener actually digging, right? Someone working on the grounds. At this time, it would have been a man named John Ouseley. John Ouseley was an Irishman. He came into America through New Jersey, South Amboy, New Jersey. He goes to Washington. He gets a job at the president's house, and he stays for 27 years. So there haven't been that many head gardeners. John Ouseley was important because he taught President John Quincy Adams how to garden. John Quincy Adams, right, he comes to the presidency. He has not been a gardener, even though his parents were very interested in gardening and farming, but John Quincy Adams was trained as a diplomat and a lawyer. He was an unhappy president, let's just say. He didn't actually win the election of 1824. There were 5 candidates. Andrew Jackson was very popular, and John Quincy Adams. They were sort of neck and neck. Andrew Jackson wins the, Andrew Jackson wins the popular vote, but it was so close that they threw it to the House of Representatives. And the other candidates backed John Quincy Adams. So he gets to be president, right? So what do Jackson's supporters think? They go, this is the corrupt bargain. And they fight John Quincy Adams at every step during his presidency. And so he's kind of depressed. And he finds gardening, and he starts writing in his diaries about the garden. And this Irish gardener, Mr. Ouseley, who he sometimes calls my nomenclator, because John Ouseley is teaching John Quincy Adams the botanical names of plants. This is all discoverable by you at the Massachusetts Historical Society, and John Quincy Adams' diaries, thanks to them, are also all online. You can read all 41 volumes of them. If you have nothing to do this summer, it gets a little hot, you can read John Quincy Adams' diaries. But he talks about all of the things he's planting with this gardener, and he particularly falls in love with trees. And so if he were coming to visit here, he'd be stooping down to collect tree seeds, like, ooh, well, it's anything to seed yet, but certainly in the fall. If you gave him a piece of fruit at a meal, he might very well pocket some of the seeds. And again, he writes them down. And so I was up in Boston at the Historical Society, and I was going through the diary, because as you know, if you've done any research, the good stuff is still on paper, right? They have a lot of stuff online. So I'm going through diary pages on microfilm. Remember those, right? It's a big machine, it's black and white, and you put this reel on, it goes, and I came across this. Now, you will know that I'm truly a plant nerd because my heart rate went up when I saw it. It was clearly a drawing of a potted seedling, and in John Quincy Adams' handwriting, there was a propagation record from the 1820s. Here's the date I planted this apple seed. Here's the date it germinated. On this date, it was 4 inches high. On this date, I transplanted it. I think that is a wonderful thing. And so it appears in my book in color. And I don't think it's ever been in print before. And I just think that that is really endearing. So I now think of John Quincy Adams as our gardening president. He also started America's first forestry project in Florida on the Panhandle. He had a whole big area planted up with live oaks because he thought that that would be the future of the Navy. Of course, the Navy changed from wooden ships to metal ships, but that's another story. All right, John Quincy Adams, one-term president, our gardening president, but in comes roaring Andrew Jackson. There he is. Andrew Jackson, he was a war hero, and he was really popular, and I think he was sort of larger than life. And I know he was definitely cool because I found this on the internet. It's amazing what you can find. This is positive proof that people have way too much time on their hands. Jackson was so popular that after the inauguration, when they have the party at the White House, it was so crowded in the house and so kind of raucous that they worried about Jackson's safety. But the party planners, so those of you who do refreshments here, keep this in mind, because to solve the problem, pretty easy. They put the barrels of whiskey out in the garden, and that got the people out of the house. So there you go. Jackson, at this period, truly was in mourning, because just before he came to Washington for the swearing in, his wife Rachel died quite suddenly at their home in the Hermitage in Tennessee. And so the story goes that Jackson brought either cuttings or saplings of Magnolia grandiflora, which I know you're quite familiar with down here, and planted them next to the south portico. They have been there, for well over 100 years. Unfortunately, they are now a safety issue, and I think if they have not been taken down already, they are going to be taken down. When I saw them, they were entirely hollow. All of the trunks were hollow, and they were all cabled up to this big, flagpole contraption with tree cable. So nothing lasts forever. A tree is a living thing, and I'm sure that they have propagated cuttings from that as well. All right, we're going to do some time travel, and I can hear you going, oh, thank goodness, should we talk about every president? Here are the 1850s. We're going to move right along. And if James Polk was your favorite, I'm sorry. We'll go up to James Buchanan. This is now right before the Civil War. Right before the Civil War. James Buchanan was a bachelor. He was from Pennsylvania. When he came to the White House as president, he brings with him his niece, an adult niece, she was in her 20s, named Harriet Lane, to act as his hostess and first lady. Now, Harriet Lane was like the Princess Diana of the late 1850s. She was very stylish and, you know, young, attractive, and the media followed her. The media in that time being newspapers. And so when her uncle had a proper plant conservatory built onto the west side of the White House, this was news. So it appears, and it was full of tropical plants, the kind of thing that you would put in a conservatory. It appeared in early photographs. So here's a photograph from around 1861. You can see over here where today is the West Wing. There were glass houses right there. And you can also see people sort of lounging around on the back. There was a retaining wall at the time. And notice that we did not invent graffiti in the 20th century. This is 19th century graffiti. Mrs. Lincoln loved flowers. So she is often shown with these like tiaras of flowers or nosegays or corsages. The gardeners were responsible at the time for the flower arranging as well. So they wore both hats at the time. Mrs. Lincoln also liked buying things, right? She liked to buy clothes. She was a proper Kentucky Southern belle. She was redecorating. And I guess it needed it at the time. But, you know, redecorating is expensive. So she ran through the appropriation that Congress had given, and her creditors were after her. But the gardener said something like, Mrs. Lincoln, no problem. I will make it look as though I bought more plants and more soil, and you can pay your creditors out of the grounds budget. This was at least Mr. Watt's idea. If any of you are accountants, if there are any accountants, this is a no-no. Congress gets wind of it. They call it the manure fund. And Mr. Watt is dismissed. He's the only head gardener to be dismissed for cause. I don't know what Mrs. Lincoln did after that. The grounds of the White House at the time during the Lincoln administration were described by one of his bodyguards as sort of a casual Southern plantation. Still lots of vegetables and fruits. Mrs. Lincoln liked to go out and pick strawberries in season. The boys had pet goats. Of course, there were stables on the grounds. And I came across in the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, this map. This was the earliest real plan I could find that was kind of, I'll call it as built, right? This was the way it actually looked. And you can see a couple things here. So this is the White House right here. That L, those are the glass houses. So they keep getting bigger. Over here, it looks like a little farm. There are all these little rows. And then in the back, so this is the south lawn, there's this, I don't know what you call that, like squash-shaped, cello-shaped driveway. And when I saw this map, it was big, this plan, I thought, aha, because I had read this kind of tirade by a congressman who was complaining about everything related to the presidency, including the landscape. And he called something on the grounds Amazon's bosoms. Now, if you look at this and use your imagination a little bit, and there are these two little artificial hills. So there you go. All right, we'll skip ahead again. This is Rutherford B Hayes. Rutherford B, you now remember, rhymes with tree. Rutherford B Hayes from Ohio, a great tree planter, both at his home in Ohio and at the White House. He and his wife, Lucy Webb Hayes, started the tradition of commemorative tree planting on the ground. So planting a tree in honor of someone or something. They also started the Easter egg roll, which just happened. And during the Hayes administration, because the president and Mrs. Hayes were temperance advocates, now this is way before Prohibition, but the White House was dry, no alcohol served. This was not popular with everyone. In fact, their Secretary of State wrote of one of their parties, "It was a brilliant affair. The water flowed like champagne." That was their Secretary of State. So instead of offering you an after-dinner drink, the President and the First Lady would get up from their table, and they would usher you and the rest of the guests through doorways that they had punched in from the state dining room right into the glass houses. And they would give you a tour of the plants, and then that would be the end of the party. So, oh well. They liked their plants. They brought with them from Ohio their gardener named Henry Pfister. Henry Pfister, born, raised, trained in Switzerland. So European trained, comes to America, makes his way to Ohio, and then to Washington. And note, he stays as the White House head gardener for 25 years. Little theme there. So he's responsible, and that is Henry Pfister, for all of the indoor plants. Here he's watering the cinerarias in the glass houses. And he was also responsible for the grounds outside. I will say, as an aside, this was the period when there was some kind of rockery or grotto in those glass houses. So it's the closest thing I've ever seen to a rock garden in the history of the White House. So there's Henry Pfister inside. He was also responsible for this high Victorian planting, those carpet beds and these big potted palms, responsible for all of the floral decorations as well. So this is out the front door, looking towards Lafayette Square. Out the back door, so out the south facade of the White House, there was something of an eyesore. It wasn't directly the landscape. So again, there's the White House, that little one there. So the landscaping is growing in, but your focal point, the thing at the distance that's right there when you look out, is the unfinished Washington Monument. Can you all see it right there? So Washington Monument started in the 1840s as a private endeavor, right? This is now the late 1870s. They ran out of money, and it sat for decades unfinished. And after the Civil War, the federal government says, look, enough, we're going to take this over. They give it to the Army Corps of Engineers to finish, which they do, but when the light is right, can you see where they picked up? Right? It's not an exact match. Now again, to put yourself in the time, when the Washington Monument was being completed, this was the largest man-made structure in the world. So this was a really big deal for the pride of our nation. And so it's before the Eiffel Tower, right? Before all those other things. So of course, when it's done, they have a really big party. Chester A. Arthur is president, so he sort of heads the festivities, and I was so glad because Chester A. Arthur graduated from Union College in Schenectady, and so had my husband. So I had to get him in the book somewhere. So that's where he fit. Grover Cleveland, great for presidential trivia. He was president twice, 2 non-consecutive terms. So he's the only person to have served non-consecutive terms. Benjamin Harrison was in the middle. And the only president to have married during his term in the White House. So he marries Frances Folsom, big news event. And hooray, in the news, there's also a lovely etching that day of the grounds. Look at the glass houses by this time. So by now, you have a rose house, a violet house, an orchid house. They do all of the propagating for bedding plants and for cut flowers. And if you think that the artist exaggerated, there is a photograph. So it was really a whole complex under glass. And there is the closest I could find to a rockery. This is what went out in your newsletter with my article. You can see it's not a rock garden in the modern sense. It's much more of that Victorian sort of, amassing of rocks and sticking things in the middle. And it was obviously shady because there are lots of ferns. Many of the presidents and first ladies loved the glass houses. There is Mrs. McKinley sitting in the glass houses surrounded by plants. Her husband loved carnations, so the gardeners would cut carnations every day and bring them to William McKinley. And so after his assassination, remember McKinley was assassinated, he was opening up a World's Fair in Buffalo, New York, and he was shot. For many years after that, America celebrated Carnation Day on his birthday, which we have forgotten, but that was his favorite flower. So, when McKinley was assassinated, anyone remember who became president?
Teddy Roosevelt.
Teddy, I hear it in the back. Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt was young, and he had a big family, and this will come into the story. I will also say that I kind of fell for Teddy Roosevelt in doing this research because, among other things, I found that he wrote picture letters to children, which is something that he shared with Beatrix Potter, another of my topics. Here's an example. Teddy Roosevelt was not the artist Beatrix Potter was, but he's writing to his daughter, and he says, "Darling Ethel, here goes for the picture letter." He puts a little cartoon and writes underneath it, "Ethel administers necessary discipline to Archie and Quentin, her two younger brothers." There they are. There is Archie saluting, and I guess that's the Secret Service of the time. And Quentin is actually yawning at the camera. So it's a very, very cute picture. They were always in trouble. They cut a baseball diamond into the White House lawn. This was not popular with the gardeners, as you can imagine. There is the eldest Roosevelt boy, and I'll show him in the glass houses where he had his pet parrot. You may remember Teddy Roosevelt was a Harvard man. So he actually named the parrot for the president of Yale, the founder of Yale. But that's the parrot Eli. Eli Yale was the first president. So Teddy Roosevelt had all of these children, and he did not have enough room. He couldn't get his work done because all the bedrooms were filled up, and downstairs were the public rooms. So he calls an architect named Charles McKim. McKim, Mead and White, famous architecture firm of the time. And he says, "I need some additions. I need more space." So that is when the glass houses go away, when the additions go on. So the plants are all saved. They were all moved to other propagating greenhouses. Actually, some of the glass houses were moved as well, although none of them are still in existence. But there's Quentin helping that day. I'm sure he was a big help moving those plants. And so the additions were put on, the beginning of the east and west wings. When the additions were done, Teddy Roosevelt and his wife wanted a new garden. Colonial Revival, right? Victorian was out of style. Here's the new style, Colonial Revival. Little boxwood edges, lots of old-fashioned annuals and perennials, very loose in style, and lots of roses. And they like to have breakfast out on the south portico under those awnings. If you see the awnings right there, they'd like to sit there for breakfast when the weather was nice, and then take a stroll out in the garden. And there's Edith Roosevelt, the First Lady. With the Tafts, in comes the automobile, lots of changes to the American landscape. And it is Mrs. Taft who brings another horticultural icon to the nation's capital, probably just finished blooming now, the cherry blossoms. She did not do it alone. She had the help of David Fairchild, big name, and also a journalist who was actually enamored of Japan. And it was a complicated story. This is actually the second set of cherry trees, because the first set was so infested with pests and diseases it had to be burned. This was a gift from Japan, 1,000 saplings. That must have been quite the conversation right after they had to burn them. But they got another set, and it was immediately popular once they got them in the ground. There were two Mrs. Wilsons. So the first Mrs. Wilson was a gardener, Ellen Axon Wilson. She was an oil painter, very interesting woman. And when she moves to the White House with her husband, Woodrow Wilson, she wants a new garden. Not Colonial Revival, it's 10 years later now. She now wants Italianate. So she calls a woman that they knew named Beatrix Jones, later married, and Beatrix Farrand, more well known as, to design a garden for her. And so it's done Italianate, lots of hedging, central pool, again, very kind of rectilinear. But the first Mrs. Wilson died before the garden could be installed. And so, I don't know, Woodrow Wilson loved his first wife, but he was quite smitten with a new woman he met named Edith Bowling Galt. And they had sort of a lightning courtship, during which he wrote to her and said, "You are the only woman I know who can wear an orchid. On everybody else, the orchid wears the woman." Didn't know Woodrow Wilson had it in him. So they married just about a year after his first wife died. And the second Mrs. Wilson asked for the garden to be installed that the first Mrs. Wilson had designed. And so there they are, the president and first lady, in the garden, which was obviously very lovely. Now, during the Wilson administration, of course, there was the Great War, and Americans were being asked to make all sorts of sacrifices, meatless Mondays, wheatless Wednesdays. And so sheep came back to the White House lawn. There was a manpower shortage when America entered the war. They also would shear the sheep and sell the wool for the Red Cross. And Americans were being asked to garden for patriotic reasons. Posters went up. The National War Garden Commission, I love this poster, because something is happening with those two potatoes in the middle. And you see their faces, they look very unhappy. Between the wars, right, I now think of this as the Downton Abbey period. So there is Mrs. Harding with her feathered hat, congratulating the winner of the tennis match. So recreational facilities had come to the White House grounds, just the way they come to many of our houses over time. The Hardings had been in the newspaper business, so they knew how to work the media, and they would have all sorts of press conferences. There are a lot of photographs of the president and Mrs. Harding and their heir-deal, Laddie Boy. Very popular, gets a lot of press time. I even read a Boston paper asking Laddie Boy if he'd run for president. This picture is great because you see Laddie Boy in that iteration of the Rose Garden. So there was a rose garden near the Oval Office, or what became the Oval Office, from about the time of the Wilson administration. And there really have always been roses on the grounds. During the Second World War, during the FDR administration, there was actually a victory garden on the grounds of the White House. It was not tended by Eleanor and Franklin, but by White House advisor Harry Hopkins and his wife and stepdaughter Diana. So there was a little victory garden there. Truman wanted some privacy. Not for himself, but for his wife, who did not love being first lady. So Truman goes to Congress with two models of the back of the White House. Little models, so little architectural models. The one on the top showed the White House as it was, with the awnings. The one on the bottom is what Truman wanted. He said, let's take off the awnings and insert a balcony across the second floor so that from the private rooms, you know, the residence, you can get out to the outside without being in the public eye. And so that was eventually done. It cost $15,000, which seems like a real bargain nowadays. Unfortunately, the Trumans didn't enjoy it for long because the White House was starting to kind of collapse, I think is the word, during the Truman administration. Things like his bathtub started coming down to the first floor from the second floor. This is not good news. So they actually evacuated the first family, the Trumans and their daughter Margaret, and they rebuilt the White House from the inside in the late 40s, early 50s. And so he's about to move back in, and Harry Truman asks for an instant garden, kind of a la HGTV, you know, one of those programs where you get a new garden in a weekend. I think he was expecting the Queen of the Netherlands to come visit. And so here we are, February 1952. The newspapers say they are rolling out the garden like wall-to-wall carpeting. So you have the sod coming out, where they put in a bomb shelter, right? This is the 50s. Look at the size of those boxwood, the balls, the root balls on the boxwood from Goody Nursery. They planted those around the north portico. They are still there, and they are still called the Truman boxwoods. We got our taxpayer dollars worth out of them. And a full-size cherry tree in bloom planted that week. So I guess he got his instant garden after all. Eisenhower loved golf, so he had a putting green designed and installed. Now, if there are golfers in the house, I know he is not putting. It's the only photograph I could find of him. I did find a cartoon. This is President Eisenhower at the, you see the White House in the back. You will note a squirrel is dropping an acorn on the president's head, and he is missing his putt, for those of you who are golfers. Eisenhower had a thing against squirrels at the time for this reason, and they did actually have a trap and transport policy for squirrels. You know it doesn't work, right? On the White House grounds. And this is not a lie. In Congress, someone started a Save the Squirrels campaign. Still goes on, right? It's nothing changed. The Kennedys, all sorts of new design. Mrs. Kennedy works on the inside. President Kennedy thought that the gardens needed to be upgraded. And so he calls a friend, Rachel Lambert Mellon, Bunny Mellon, and asks her to work with him to come up with a design. She was a well-known horticulturist. And so they work together, they come up with a design, she goes to install it, obviously with help. And it's interesting what you find when you dig at the White House. So they came up with horseshoes from the old stables and bits of the old glass houses, pots and things. And one day they cut through the national security telephone line and triggered an atomic alert. Really happened. So, moral of the story, call before you dig. This was the Rose Garden. It's what is right outside the Oval Office. This is a spring shot, so you almost don't see roses. They ordered 3,000 tulips for the first installation. Those little Kingsville dwarf boxwoods, the Catherine crab apples. It's a beautiful design, and still the one that's followed today, even though it has been completely replanted once. Same plants. It was so successful that the President and Mrs. Kennedy asked for a companion garden on the east side, which Mrs. Mellon designed. Unfortunately, it was about to go in when the Kennedys left for Dallas. And so it was put on hold. There is the East Garden, but it was not installed until the next administration, the Johnson administration. So Mrs. Johnson dedicated the garden to Jacqueline Kennedy, which is why it's sometimes called the Jacqueline Kennedy Garden. And of course, she's known for her beautification efforts around the country, and of course, wildflowers. So the gardens, they have been used for so many things. Weddings, this is one of the Nixon daughters' weddings. Parties, this is the Bicentennial Party, 1976. And you see here, Vice President Rockefeller, in the middle, the Queen of England, and Gerald Ford, the President. The President and Queen are exchanging toasts. And she was very assertive that night and said in her toast, "Mr. President, history is not a fairy tale." And she goes on to talk about the British burning of the White House. Given that she was in a tent in the Rose Garden, seems very brave somehow. Diplomacy. Here is Jimmy Carter and Egyptian President Anwar Sadat out in the Rose Garden. Children. So out on the grounds, many different first children. Here's Jimmy Carter again with Amy Carter and a treehouse that he had designed. Remember, he was a naval engineer, and the White House carpenters built in the branches of a great blue atlas cedar, and the tree is still there. The tree house is long gone. And I think that's actually Jimmy Carter's grandson, which would make him Amy Carter's nephew, right? There was a big age range. Lots of puppies. There's Barbara Bush with Millie and Millie's puppies, so lots and lots of first canines. Art exhibits. During the Clinton administration in the East Garden, American sculpture exhibits. Still tree planting. They do replace trees occasionally, right? Trees don't last forever, and there's George W. Bush and Laura Bush planting a new tree on the north lawn. And the trees are magnificent. I would say if there's one thing that I was most impressed with on the White House grounds, it was the trees. Just beautiful. And vegetables came back in the Obama administration as part of the First Lady's efforts towards childhood health, and Mrs. Trump has said that she is going to retain the kitchen garden, which I think is a nice thing. So I did not have to land a plane. I did not climb the fence. That wasn't me. trying to get access to the White House grounds. Although it's not that easy, as I found out. I had help. I called my congressman, right? You know, they say call your representative. I called Rodney Frelinghuysen, and he and his staff helped me first get a ticket. There are generally 2 garden tours a year, one in the spring, one in the fall, for a weekend, a Saturday and Sunday, but you do need a timed ticket. I think I had to give my social security number. You do go through security, obviously, and it's a lot of fun. But I will say, you will be with a lot of your fellow citizens. And you see the crowd that day. So, you know, again, the Marine Corps band is playing. It's beautiful. They have lots of volunteers to keep it going. But they have to rope a lot of things off, because otherwise the gardens would really get wrecked. So that was the closest I could get to the rose garden that day. I did find one thing that I had been looking for, because I had read an article from a newspaper from around 1980 where it said that the gardener had received a big statue of a male deer, you know, complete with antlers, and he had placed it outside the Oval Office. So there's the Oval Office right there, in honor of Harry Truman, who once famously said, "The buck stops here." Can you see his little face peeking out of the hedges? Can you see him? I put the red arrow. There is the little nose of the buck. It's still there. It's in the hedges. There is no sign. No one points this out. So you are now in on the secret joke. I was able to go back again with the thanks of Rodney Frelinghuysen's staff and his backing to run around after head gardener Jim Adams and just see what they were doing. It was one August day. Of course, it's Washington. It's hot and humid. They're working like bees because the first family is not in residence. So they're trying to get everything done. You can see they're switching out annuals and really working very hard. And so I got up close to everything. It's wonderful, right? I wish I could have my own personal calligrapher do my labels for my vegetable garden. It's a lovely garden. Everything is just tip-top. You can see, right, green and gray, they're National Park Service employees. You can see Jim Adams is a real gardener, because look at his pocket. You see his pocket? This is my problem in the laundry room, right? I always go, what is this stuff? What have I been doing? But like me, right, he's been deadheading and weeding as we've been going and just jamming it in his pockets. He's checking the temperature of the compost bin. So again, they work really hard. So it was really an interesting experience for me. I did not go down with the whale, as I worried that I might. You do need the occasional dose of Alka-Seltzer, as I'm sure you do if you're working there. This is no longer legal. You can't use the White House in any product promotion, but this I bought on eBay, so it's amazing what you can buy on eBay. I now think of this as our common ground. So, right, whichever way you lean in terms of your political beliefs, we can come together here and say this is a landscape full of history and tradition and beauty at any time of year, but obviously in the spring. And I will just close with my absolute favorite quote from the man who held the post of White House head gardener for the longest, Irv Williams, 45 years. He started with the installation of the Rose Garden for the Kennedys, and he stayed right up to George W. Bush. That is a really long time. And he once said, what's great about the job is that our trees, our plants, our shrubs know nothing about politics. Thank you very much.